It's a summer night in 1974. The sun has just dropped behind the rooftops of East Los Angeles, the heat of the day is finally breaking, and a low rumble starts rolling down a 4-mile stretch of asphalt. It is not the roar of racing engines. It is something slower, something prouder. Chrome bumpers catch the last orange light. Hydraulic pumps hiss and click. A candy paint job, so deep and glossy it looks wet, glides past at maybe 5 miles an hour, bouncing gently on its suspension like it is dancing to a rhythm only it can hear. Thousands of people line the sidewalks, not to watch a parade, but because this is Friday night, and Friday night on Whittier Boulevard is where the whole neighborhood comes alive. This was cruising. And Whittier Boulevard was its beating heart. To understand why this one stretch of road in Los Angeles became so legendary, you have to go back further than the Lowriders themselves, back to the years right after World War II. Mexican-American families had been settling into East Los Angeles for generations, building tight-knit communities in neighborhoods like Boyle Heights, City Terrace, and unincorporated East LA. Whittier Boulevard ran right through the commercial spine of that world, lined with drive-in restaurants, movie theaters, record shops, and clothing stores. It was the kind of street where everybody knew everybody, where a Friday night walk down the sidewalk meant running into half your school and most of your extended family. At the same time, an entire generation of young men were coming home from the war and from Korea with a new relationship to machines. Many had worked on aircraft, trucks, and heavy equipment during their service, and they brought that mechanical fluency home with them. Cars, which had once been simple transportation, became something else entirely, a canvas. A statement. A way to say something about who you were in a world that did not always make space for you to say it out loud. And here is where the philosophy of the lowrider really starts to separate itself from every other corner of American car culture. Up in the hot rod scene, the whole point was speed. Strip the car down, drop in a bigger engine, make it fast, make it loud, make it fly down the drag strip. But in East Los Angeles, a different idea took hold, and it became almost a form of quiet rebellion. Instead of going fast, why not go slow? Instead of stripping the car down, why not build it up, layer by layer, until it became a rolling piece of art? The phrase that came to define the whole movement was simple: low and slow. It was, in its own way, a rejection of the mainstream car culture's obsession with speed and power, and an embrace of style, patience, and presence. The lowering itself started out mechanically simple and, frankly, a little dangerous. Guys would cut their coil springs, drop sandbags in the trunk, or heat the springs to weaken them, all just to bring the body of the car down closer to the pavement. But there was a problem. Los Angeles had a vehicle code that made it illegal to drive a car whose frame sat lower than the bottom of its wheel rims. Police up and down the city used that law to pull over lowriders constantly, and it became one of the earliest and most persistent points of friction between the cruising community and law enforcement. Then, sometime in the late 1950s, somebody had an idea that would change everything. What if, instead of a fixed low ride height, the car could go up and down on command? Early builders started experimenting with surplus hydraulic pumps, the same kind used to raise and lower the flaps on airplanes, salvaged from aircraft scrapyards around Southern California. Wire it into the suspension, run it off a set of switches on the dashboard, and suddenly a driver could cruise down the boulevard scraping the pavement, then flip a switch and pop the car right back up to legal height the moment a police cruiser rolled into view. It was clever, it was defiant, and it worked. By the 1960s, hydraulics had become the signature technology of the lowrider world, and a whole new skill set emerged around it, with builders competing to make their cars hop higher, dance harder, and bounce in ways that seemed to defy physics entirely. Car clubs formed all across East LA during this period, and they became something much bigger than just groups of friends who liked the same kind of car. Clubs like the Dukes, one of the oldest and most respected lowrider clubs in the country, gave young men a sense of structure, brotherhood, and pride at a time when many East LA neighborhoods were dealing with poverty, discrimination, and heavy-handed policing. Building a lowrider took months, sometimes years, and real money. Members pooled knowledge, tools, and sometimes literal parts to help each other finish their builds. The car became a shared community achievement as much as an individual one, and on any given weekend, a caravan of a dozen or more club cars rolling down Whittier Boulevard together, painted, chromed, and gliding low, was a visible, unmistakable declaration that this neighborhood had its own culture, its own art form, and its own version of the American dream on wheels. And the boulevard itself was the stage for all of it. Whittier Boulevard in its cruising heyday was lined with the kind of spots that became legendary in their own right. Drive-in restaurants where carhops delivered burgers and shakes right to your rolled-down window, giving drivers a reason to slow down and idle for a while before circling back around to do it all again. On a peak Friday or Saturday night through the 1960s and into the 70s, the boulevard could see bumper-to-bumper traffic for hours, a slow river of chrome and candy paint flowing past sidewalks packed with spectators, families, and teenagers who had walked down just to be part of the scene. It was not unusual to see the same beautifully finished cars circle the same 4-mile loop for an entire evening, drivers and passengers calling out to friends on the sidewalk, music drifting out of open windows, the whole street functioning like one enormous open-air block party that happened every single week. Music and cruising were inseparable. Oldies, soul, and lowrider anthems provided the soundtrack, blasting from custom sound systems that were often almost as carefully built as the hydraulics themselves. The visual style that developed alongside the mechanics was just as intricate. Builders commissioned elaborate murals on trunk lids and hoods, often depicting Aztec warriors, religious imagery, or portraits honoring family members. Pinstriping, gold leafing, and deep candy lacquer paint jobs that could take dozens of coats to perfect turned ordinary Chevrolet Impalas and Buick Regals into rolling masterpieces. Wire wheel rims with wide white wall tires became the signature look, so recognizable that even decades later, a single glimpse of those spoked wheels instantly signals lowrider culture to anyone who grew up around it. But a culture this visible, this proud, and this closely tied to a specific ethnic community did not exist without conflict. Law enforcement treated the crowds on Whittier Boulevard with growing suspicion through the 1970s, and the relationship between cruisers and police grew increasingly tense. That tension boiled over on New Year's Eve in 1979, when a night of cruising turned into a confrontation between the crowd and police that left the boulevard the scene of unrest. In the aftermath, the city of Los Angeles moved to formally restrict cruising, eventually passing ordinances that made it illegal to drive the same stretch of road repeatedly within a certain period of time. Officers were stationed along the boulevard specifically to break up the very tradition that had defined the street for decades. For a community that had built something beautiful out of very little, watching their own culture get legislated against felt like one more example of a world that welcomed their labor but not their joy. Yet lowrider culture did not disappear. It adapted. Car shows became a major new outlet, moving the celebration off the public street and into fairgrounds, parking lots, and eventually convention centers, where builders could show off increasingly elaborate creations without running afoul of anti-cruising laws. Lowrider magazine, founded in the mid-1970s, gave the movement a national and eventually international audience, turning what had started as a distinctly East LA phenomenon into a style embraced from Japan to Brazil. Hydraulics kept evolving too, with competitions for hopping and dancing cars becoming their own spectacle, judged on how high a car could bounce or how dramatically it could tilt from side to side. In the decades since, Whittier Boulevard has never fully lost its identity, even as the anti-cruising ordinances remained on the books for generations. The street is remembered in film, in music, in murals, and in the collective memory of a community that refuses to let the tradition fade. And in a full-circle moment that says something about how deeply this culture is woven into California's identity, the state of California repealed its statewide ban on cruising in the early 2020s, opening the door for cities to once again allow the very activity that police had spent decades trying to stamp out. Whittier Boulevard, along with other legendary cruising streets across Southern California, has since seen organized cruise nights return, with new generations of builders bringing out cars every bit as stunning as anything that rolled down the boulevard back in 1974. What makes this story so compelling is not just the chrome or the candy paint or the ingenious hydraulic engineering, though all of that is genuinely remarkable. It is the way a community turned a simple act, driving a car down a public street, into an entire language of pride, patience, and belonging. Every hour spent perfecting a paint job, every hydraulic switch wired by hand, every Sunday spent polishing wire wheels, was an investment in something that could not be taken away, a form of ownership and artistry in a world that did not always extend those things freely. Low and slow was never really about the speed of the car at all. It was about taking your time, being seen, and being proud of exactly where you came from. So the next time you see a lowrider bouncing gently at a stoplight, or catch a glimpse of a deep candy paint job glowing under the streetlights, remember that you are looking at more than a car. You are looking at the living legacy of Whittier Boulevard, a 4-mile stretch of Los Angeles asphalt that became one of the most important cultural landmarks in all of American car history, built low, built slow, and built to last.